I want to thank all of you for being here with me today. I'm really excited to share your story of getting ACT for ALS passed through your advocacy efforts with a little help from GIS. So thank you. I'd really love to hear who each of you are and what your role has been in making this happen. So can I start with you, Deb?
Yeah, so I'm Deb Paust. I lost my husband, Tim, just about 8 years ago to ALS. And I found my way to advocacy, and I am one of the co-chairs for the I Am ALS Legislative Affairs team.
Thank you. Michelle, tell us about yourself.
Hi, so I'm Michelle, and I'm with a new nonprofit called Voices for ALS, and we work really closely with I Am ALS. And I have no connection to ALS directly other than I had dogs who had the canine version of it and got involved researching it about 10 years ago and found my way to the community and fell in love with them and have helped lead the advocacy with the ACT.
Fantastic. Nicole, will you introduce yourself?
My name is Nicole Simbura. I lost my husband, Mike, to ALS a little over 3 years ago now. I also co-chair the legislative team with I Am ALS and have been involved in changing the landscape of this disease since he was diagnosed in 2015.
Thank you very much. Sandy, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Kylan Morris. I'm Sandy Morris's oldest daughter. So my mom's voice used to sound a whole lot like mine. So I'm going to be helping her speak today. But mom was diagnosed January 2018. January 6, 2018. And so she just kind of caught fire with this space and ran with it. And we're here still. So 5 years almost to symptom onset.
That's our goal.
We're looking to get to our August this year with that. So
yeah. So what happened is that I found Brian Wallach and started working with I Am ALS. And Nicole was the one that put me on fire for legislation. So Nicole and I used to run the legislation team. I'm so grateful that they have so many leaders over there now. But it was Nicole's idea to start the ALS caucus. So she and I went around and tried to get people involved with that. That's probably enough.
could you guys hear all that?
We could hear that, and we're grateful for you both being here. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with sort of this baseline foundation building question. First, acknowledging what an amazing accomplishment it has been to get all 100 senators and 423 House representatives to vote in favor of the ACT for ALS. So how are you able to get almost 100% of Congress to support the ACT?
I'll jump in real quick to say that just relentless advocates that work together. We work with different organizations, and we were unstoppable, really. But it was a strong community, a big desire. We had some general government affairs advising us. We had some help in our strategy in what we were doing. But yeah, pure relentless advocates.
I want to give kudos to Nicole and Sandy and Deb at I Am ALS, because what they did initially is Nicole had the idea to start an ALS caucus with Congress. And so long before we had the bill that was introduced, they were building relationships with the members in the House and the Senate and educating them about ALS, so that once we had this bill, we already had a foundation. And that made a big difference in getting the bill passed, because we were able to go to them as allies.
I think for people viewing this, I think it's going to be really important for them to understand this is part of a really long-term plan of relationship building and advocacy.
Yeah, in the chat, Sandy says blood, sweat, and tears.
My family and mom rolled up and
With
down
Nicole and her family.
with Nicole and her family.
And
And really, truly, like
Yep.
just relentless advocates, rolled up and down the halls of DC and would go meet with these folks that really, they would just cross their arms and
shake their head
shake their head, and they,
until one day
until one day the rock split.
they uncrossed their arms and said, wow, you weren't kidding. This is a very hard disease. And they started to believe us. And that was the beginning.
It was all about education, and what Sandy always said, kind of one of her slogans is heartbreak to action, right? You have to be willing to get out there and share your story and educate. And in doing so and building those relationships, we have slowly gotten a whole lot of people to care about this community and to understand that we're finally there with the science. And so now we need to have policy to get those drugs into bodies, right? We need those therapies to get into bodies. And Act for ALS has done just that, or will be doing that here soon.
Yeah, I agree, Nicole. And I think we stand out as advocates because there's smart people behind these actions and we're educated. And I think we stand out because of the knowledge that we have, and we've shared that amongst the other advocates. So I don't think offices are used to that kind of power.
And, you know, when Deb, you were talking about being relentless and having so many meetings, I mean, you guys did some of everything, right? You did calls and letters, Zoom meetings, in-person meetings. You did a lot, and that took a lot of effort. And sometimes you had to employ all of those tactics just to get one co-sponsor. So what were the big challenges in keeping everybody focused with all of these activities going on?
You know, I think we were focused and I think we were motivated, but there were some hurdles, some stagnant times. And I have to say, when we saw Pat's map, those were motivating. You know, he would have maps of states that who was on and who wasn't on. And everything that we needed. And the visual part of the map is a little motivating because, you know, you're doing your calls, you're on your computer, and to see success in a good looking map, you know, when you're tired and weary, blood, sweat, and tears is totally true. You know, we've all been on calls together and they're emotional. People are sharing their heartbreaking stories. And, you know, I think I probably cry on 70% of my calls, and I know I'm not alone. And, you know, so that's a little challenging because you're fighting so hard with every Zoom call.
Just trying to get their support, but Pat's maps were just vital. I know for myself, like one of the big things were, and like Deb had alluded to, that we really had strategy, right? So like when we were focusing on people with Veterans Affairs committees and such, Pat's maps were amazing because I could go there and be like, hey, you have almost 48,000 veterans in your district. Do you realize how many of those people will be impacted by ALS, right? And being able to share the articles and such, and he'll put links on the map so we can pull those articles up and just share them, making us look like we've done all this hard work and digging and such, but really it's, you know, we were blessed because Pat consolidated it all for us on the map, and we could just go there, and it made us look great. It made us look very, very talented.
It was a huge time saver because we were digging up that information, and now we know we can just go to the map for that. So the time saving in that is phenomenal.
We knew, we all were passionate about fighting for this, but we didn't have solutions to get it done. We knew where we wanted to go. And so Pat framed this with a solution for us, right? We knew, for example, that veterans have up to a 10x risk of getting ALS. Well, we could tell people that, but if we were just talking about it at the national level, it wasn't really helpful. So we targeted people on the Veterans Affairs committees first, because we knew that that was something that would be bipartisan. But what Pat did was he gave us the data that we could talk to each congressperson about in their particular state, and about what Deb just mentioned, 48,000 people in your state or 1.5 million in California. When you have that kind of constituency, it may just be Michelle and Deb and Sandy and Pat on the call. But when you can say there's a 1.5 million veterans in your state who are of a 10 times higher risk of getting this disease, then it becomes real for the Congress people. And so that helped. And the other things he incorporated into the map were the members on the ALS caucus, the members on the rare disease caucus, the people on the Alzheimer's caucus. So we wanted to find Congress people that understood what neurodegenerative diseases were, because we know they would be easier to convince to get involved with this bill. And so having those different people we could target. And so 1 week we would target veterans. And then a couple of weeks later, we would target people on the rare disease caucus. And a couple of weeks later, we would target people. And so we worked our way through it. So his framework gave us kind of like the check marks that we could go through with the most likely sponsors of the bill. So it really was a game changer with Congress, but it was also a game changer with the community, like Deb said, because Pat would post these success stories, right? So whenever you have goals, you want to win the battles till you get to the winning the war. And Pat enabled us to see that we were winning the battles. Look, we've got two of the 5 Congress people in Kansas. How can we get the others? Who do you know in those communities? And so really made a huge difference having that as a tool to help us get this bill passed.
Yeah, Sandy said in the chat that it was a game changer, and it was motivating. She says we're fighting for the orange, and we needed the visual, and we got the visual. And just another quick thing I want to say about Pat's map is, by doing those different caucuses, it kind of, he led us to, some possible low hanging fruit, because we would, get 8 co-sponsors in a week, and then we wouldn't get anything. But with his map, he directed us to some of what might've been easier co-sponsors to get. So the motivation worked in a couple of different ways for advocates.
And Deb, a great offshoot from that was if we had, 20 members of the ALS caucus that had sponsored the bill, and only 3 hadn't, it gave us more power to go back to the other 3 and say, listen, you're the only 3 left on this in your entire caucus that haven't sponsored. What can we do to answer the questions so that you can join your colleagues? And so it gave us lots of tools.
In the beginning, it was just Nicole and Mom.
And we had so many people that wanted to help us, so
Don't bring us a casserole.
bring us your rep.
Bring us your rep.
And Pat's map allowed us to show them where they fit in. So it was an absolute game changer.
It takes a village to fight this disease, and you really need to use and reach out to everyone. I mean, I've talked to people, goodness, at hotels that I was checking into when Mike and I would travel, and the person would be like, yeah, we're happy to join. And like Sandy's saying, we can put those people on the map, right? So it shows, we want the whole map orange where everyone has a constituent there.
With Pat and Amanda's help, made it so easy for people to join, for people to contact their representatives. I mean, that was all included. You had multiple different maps and dashboards that did different things, and story maps. Was there one particular that you thought had the most impact, or that had surprising information in some way that you could share with the audience?
I don't know that I could say one. I think all of them were impactful with different people for different reasons. And that's what we needed to get the bill passed, right? The military stuff was impactful for the people that had military connections. But if you weren't a congressman on the VA committee, or you didn't have a large military population or a base in your state, they weren't quite as moved. And so everything about the map, including, I know a lot of people who weren't techie that loved the hyperlinks that he had in there. So they could just easily go straight to Twitter. And they would go, well, I don't know anything about Twitter. How do I use Twitter? Like, look, and you don't have to worry about it. Pat's just got a link, just click it, and it'll take you right to Twitter, and the message would be there ready for them to populate. So I think there were so many different features about it that made it a great tool to help us get the bill passed.
The one that I thought was really impactful was the Ice Bucket Challenge map. So we had all these officials and legislators that participated, but weren't signed on to our bill. So that one I thought was really impactful. And I also think the death map is very impactful. We can show you how many people have died in your district. I'm not sure where those stats come from, but I think those are two that stand out for me.
I have to agree with you definitely on the Ice Bucket Challenge map. I can't tell you how many times I have shared that with people. Just, I mean, yes, about ALS, but the brilliance of showing that dichotomy of, you know, hey, you supported this, and where is your support now?
Yeah, and people piggybacked on that idea because they pulled the video of that person doing the challenge. I mean, it was all on Twitter, and it was pressure.
It is pressure. Like Deb was saying, I mean, to see, like, here I was doing this, you know, the Ice Bucket Challenge back in 2014, but I have yet to sign on to this bill. It's like, that's not okay. You know, you claim to support us. We really need you to, you know, lean in and help here.
So I wonder, sort of along the same lines, why did some senators decide not to co-sponsor the act, but they ended up voting for the act?
So we had a lot of hurdles, different hurdles on each side of the aisle, as you can imagine. I know because you've got a huge healthcare audience listening to this, one of our biggest hurdles on both sides of the aisle was they didn't want to sponsor a disease-specific bill. And we heard that over and over and over again. And so that feedback ultimately led us to include a clause about all neurodegenerative diseases when we did revisions of the bill. And that helped overcome some of that hurdle. Other people wouldn't sponsor it because it didn't have what's called a CBO number, the Congressional Budget Office number, that was going to show how it was paid for. But this is where Pat's map made such a big difference, because the people who didn't want to sponsor kind of were like, I give up. I'll vote for the bill, even if they weren't going to sponsor it, because once we got to 200 sponsors in the House and 250, and then we got to 280, which meant we didn't have to have a vote in committee. It could just go straight to the House floor for a vote. They didn't want to be the people that weren't sponsoring it. So the more sponsors we got, the more difficult it was for somebody not to sponsor or not to agree to vote for it. There were other differences on each side of the aisle, but I think those, you guys would probably agree,
Yeah, and
were the biggest ones.
I think the other was there was some misinformation that the expanded access programs were possibly going to interfere with clinical trials. And that was not true at all, but we had to bring in specialists. I mean, some offices wanted to hear them from specialists themselves in a private meeting. So we arranged that. And then it took a while for that correction to kind of filter through. So that's the other thing that I thought was a big stumbling block early on, midway through.
But we, like Deb said earlier, we were relentless. We wouldn't let them go. They would give us questions, and then we'd answer their questions, and we'd follow back up 2 weeks later. Like, hey, we haven't heard back from you. You're not on the bill. We responded to these. Can we have another meeting? Right. And so there were times, I mean, I swear with a couple of them, I met with their office at least a dozen times. Right. And then there were other issues that offices, again, coming back to needing to have an understanding of ALS, they're worried about drug prices. Well, we don't even have drugs in the pipeline yet, so let's not worry about the drug prices that this bill might, eventually be seen as a problem. Let's get drugs into bodies and see what therapies are out there, so then we can worry about drug prices, right? So it was all, again, about education.
Yeah. Hey, Pat's got something here in the chat. He says, Michelle, Sandy, Nicole, and Deb made me be gracious. We thank each co-sponsor, not just ask, but to celebrate each success. And Pat, you're gracious on your own, but thank you. But yeah, showing appreciation was absolutely something we did individually on social media platforms. Everybody likes to hear the good stuff when they're sitting in those offices.
And are continuing to do as well. I know that is building ongoing relationships with them. So some of them are running for office, and whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we all kind of took our hats off when we were fighting for this bill and said, if you're helping us, we're kind of like one issue voters, right? So if you're going to be one of the leaders that helps us get this bill passed, whether it was Anna Eshoo, liberal Democrat from Northern California, or Jerry Moran, conservative Republican from Kansas, they both played big roles. And so people like that, we're still commenting and thanking them for their support and helping us not only get the bill heard, but then they worked the bill in their respective chambers too.
I feel like I'm learning from all of you a lot about advocacy, because I admit when you were first speaking about your relentlessness and your persistence, the first thought that came to my mind was there being the squeaky wheel. I mean, that's what we're often taught, right? If you want to get something done, you got to be a squeaky wheel. But what I think I'm hearing is that advocacy is more about listening and responding and educating and being persistent in follow-up. And I think that's a striking difference from simply being squeaky. So I appreciate all the comments that are teaching me a little bit more about how to be a good advocate.
I think that's a really interesting perspective, because a lot of people have gone to the Hill to lobby for more research money, and they tell their story, but they didn't bring a solution to how to fix it. And I think that's what this community did this time, is they brought this is how we can fix this. But I think going back to what Deb said, when we talk to Democrats, we talk together, all of us, and said, okay, these are the issues that, this particular senator or this particular congressperson would have. And so if I would do Zoom calls, I'd let Deb know this is an issue they raised with us. So when they did a follow-up call, they could reinforce the messaging that we were doing, and then vice versa. So it was not just sharing your story, it was understanding the message that we had to deliver to each of the particular senators or congresspeople and addressing the concerns they had, and then making sure all of us were working together to reinforce that messaging with all of them.
Sandy's noting that, you were persistent but polite. You talked before about making sure to thank everybody, and she was indicating that you guys sent emails every 10 days and that through the ways that you went about this, they really began to trust you all over time.
We really told our story, and they cried. I had so many people cry while I was dry-eyed with my children and my husband, and they were sobbing. So we had to show them the ALS is real. We're not being dramatic. This is really our life. And I'm here in front of you today so that you will help future families not have to go through this. They fell in love with my family, and they remembered us year over year. And that was important. You have to show them the vulnerability of this disease.
Appreciate that, Sandy, and I'd like to hear from everybody on that future piece of how can people in this audience help. Through this presentation, we're certainly increasing their awareness, and we can make any of the maps available to people. What else would you like people to know so that they can help? And then also, sort of thinking about advice that you would give to this audience on their advocacy efforts, whether it's for ALS or for whatever is in their mission.
I'll jump in with, because I understand there'll be some medical professionals that will be hearing this. I think, we're hearing from the people living with ALS that a lot of their providers are not that familiar with ALS. And so I think, doing an in-service after this conference or this session, that they can go back to their fellow coworkers and clinicians and share what they've learned about ALS. I think that's a really good start. That's an easy start for advocacy for the medical professional.
I think the other thing the medical professionals can do is make this good for a lay audience, right? Because they're used to communicating with other medical professionals at medical conferences. And so we needed to bring the real life impact. In our disease, for example, we have a rating scale. called an ALS FRSR scale. That goes right over Congress's head. They don't know what that means. But I know when Nicole told her family's story, she tells the story about what 2 points different meant to her husband and how he could write again. And I probably did 100 Zoom calls with Nicole, and I probably cried on 99 of them every time I heard her story. You couldn't listen to the transparency of her story, but she made the complicated stuff that Congress doesn't usually care about. They didn't remember ALS FRSR, but they remembered that lady whose husband could write again. Right. And that's what made them care. Deb's story about her husband and how long it took him to get into a trial and the wait list to be in the trial. They felt the angst with their stories, and they remembered their stories when they went back and talked to their staffers, and they'd say, how can we help this family? That's the biggest takeaway, is make them want to help you, make them care.
And I want these professionals to realize, no matter what disease you're fighting, that we are really the experts in this, right? I mean, we're to partner together to, to come together for hopefully a positive outcome one day with ALS. But many times families are overlooked, like we aren't given credit, we don't understand and such. And we shouldn't have a seat at the table, but we definitely should have a seat at the table with this disease.
Sandy has she put together what's called the Morris Principles, right? That IMALS is talking about, and it's not about me without me. And that's exactly what Nicole just said, is give the people in the community a seat at the table so that their voices can be heard. We need the physicians and the PhDs and the docs to come back and punctuate the arguments that we're making, but find a way to give value. I would say to the people in the healthcare providers you have there, find a way to give value to your community in social media so that you can find a forum to coalesce everybody and get everybody involved, bring value to the community, and then they will get involved in helping you advocate for whatever you need to advocate for.
Sandy's making the point too that ALS is not as rare as we think. I know there was a recent study that came out that showed actually the rate of ALS as being revised from 7.7 to 9.9 cases per 100,000 population. So an increase in the prevalence of this disease. And she also notes, appropriately so, and I think this audience will be very sensitive to this idea that all of you, and particularly the people suffering with ALS, are experts too, right? And probably more so in many ways, in most ways than the medical community, because as Sandy puts it, you're living with the disease.
I was just going to say, one of the things that when you mentioned the prevalence, it used to be about 5 out of 100,000, but that still seems very rare to some people. What we know is in your lifetime, you have a 1 in 300 chance of being affected with ALS. And that's the difference in how you message it. Like, people care when it's 1 in 300. When you're like, 5 out of 100,000, I'm not as invested in it. So I think that's important. And the other data to share is how this is going to change in the future. And in our case, this disease is supposed to increase by 70% by 2040. So if you look at these horrific numbers we have now, that's part of offsetting the money concerns that some of the congressional members had. Look, it's going to increase by 70%. We're spending about $250,000 a year out of pocket for the families like Deb and Sandy and Nicole to fight this disease separate from their insurance. And you talk about those things that make an impact.
This disease is winning.
And that's what we have to change. We have to someday beat this disease so that somebody says, my grandma had that, but she's better now. That's what we fight for.
Right, to make it chronic instead of terminal. And it's as common as MS, which really startles a lot of people, because people know of a lot of people with MS, but because of this turnstile of death and the short lifespan, once you're diagnosed, you don't see it. You don't see us. And then you might see me, and then I'm gone. And then it's a new person. So that's another hurdle.
So much kudos to people like Deb and Nicole that stay in this fight after they've lost their spouses, because being on these Zoom calls with them is emotionally taxing for them. Like it's the grief over and over and over again, talking about it. And it's incredibly heart wrenching to hear people say, my husband got diagnosed back in 2015. Why are we still asking the same questions? Why are we still doing the same things? So when we lose people in this community, we lose the advocates. And I think Sandy's the one that used that phrase, turnstile of death first, wasn't she, Deb? So much kudos to them for staying in this fight, because that's what we need, their knowledge and their passion.
I love it. I have a friend that was on a flight recently, and it was with an airline, and they were doing a fundraiser for breast cancer, right? And they were passing the buckets and everyone was giving. And he actually stopped and he said, when are you guys going to do one for ALS? He's like, I've got to tell you, I know as many people that have passed from ALS, and he's not in this community. I know as many people who have passed from ALS as I have from breast cancer. He's like, we need to bring more awareness to this. And it kind of took the stewardess back for a moment, because she was like, great question. I'll follow up with this, but it's like, I want ALS to be the next sexy disease. And I've been saying that for 7 years, right? Like, everyone is happy to support breast cancer, and I'm not taking away from that at all. It's wonderful that they have, and look at how much awareness has been brought, but we also need to do the same for ALS.
And I think you guys are doing that. And one of the things that I'm also hearing a lot of is how you're approaching the translation of data to advocacy and action and storytelling. And that's, a big deal for this audience, a bunch of people who are really focused on data, whether they're in public health and thinking about broader populations, or whether they're clinicians who are thinking about the patients in front of them. And, we've talked about many things like, the national viewpoint and how that didn't really have a lot of impact for Congress people. And then we talked about, even how you look at cases per 100,000, or you have a 1 in 3 chance, or 1 in 300 chance. It's 1 in 300, hopefully not 1 in 3, but the idea. And then, Sandy talked about sharing her experiences with people, and how you've educated what ALS is like for the people who live with it and for their families. So I'm just sort of wondering, where do you see mapping and the maps that you guys have used in that continuum of translating the data in a way that people might understand better or care about?
As we were just talking, I was thinking, our next bold move could be, and I'm thinking again, because I'm thinking of congressional leaders, but sending them a map that they can navigate themselves and see, we're telling them the information, but if they had the map sent to them, they could see how many constituents, they could see how many veterans live in, that could be a more interactive tool to the people that we're trying to help us with policy change.
Definitely. Early on, Sandy and I were discussing this, like, they need the visuals, right? That they need to be able to see the faces of those impacted by ALS. And Pat was in on those early discussions, like, what can we do? How can we bring awareness? How can we show those representatives how many people are living in their district, or those senators, how many people are in their states, right? And so Pat's maps have done just that.
And I will say, one of the pillars that we fought for was getting on TV, getting on radio. And I know that a lot of the news reporters then would link to Pat's maps as well. So it wasn't just our community. Part of the problem with getting a bill passed is you have to get out of your own echo chamber. Everybody with ALS cared about ALS, but we needed to have the people who didn't have ALS care. And Pat's maps gave TV reporters who would say, here's the link on our website where you can easily go and find somebody. So he made it easy for people to help us spread awareness outside the ALS community too. Big deal.
That is a big deal. And I wonder what you're going to do next.
Pat, do I spill the beans? Pat and Amanda have been amazing. Working with doing surveys with some of the ALS clinics, because we see a lot of differences even in the veteran situations, there's some clinics that provide great services and others that don't. We're also starting to work on exposome. So Pat and Amanda are blowing my mind with everything they've been able to find. So for example, Deb is aware of a cluster of ALS in a particular community. We know that about 90% of ALS is called sporadic, caused by environmental exposures, concussions, a whole lot of things. So one of the really cool projects we're working on is taking the data about who's been diagnosed in a particular cluster, and then looking at the things from a geological survey, the EPA's toxic release data, the EPA's data on Superfund sites, if there is a burn pit close with some of the military bases, if there's an old Nike missile site. So we're finding some associations that we have known or associated with ALS, but there's never been causation that's been validated. And so one of our goals now is to take some of that data about exposures with the clusters that we found, and if the population hasn't been transient, which in some of these small towns it hasn't, they've lived there their whole lives, and then being able to give that data to researchers and say, okay, look, we've got 21 people in this small town of 5,000 people. That blows away the national prevalence. Help us figure out why. Let's do omics studies. Let's do epidemiology studies. And so it really is, again, the tool that's going to help us solve so many things in the future with this disease. He's leaving an incredible legacy with changing people's lives for decades with the work he's doing. And Amanda.
That gave me goosebumps. The potential is incredible. That's incredible.
Pretty amazing. Well, I'd like to give everybody a chance to share a last thought. What would you like this audience to know or do or think about next?
I would just like to say that this is just the beginning. We are just getting started because we had no foundation without Pat's maps, and we are just beginning what can happen in this disease. So watch us.
I want to say, join us. We are powerful in numbers. We are a fantastic group, if I say so myself. We are smart, thoughtful, and relentless, and we need your help. So whatever that looks like for you to get involved in, or just become more aware. There's groups like IMALS that provide incredible information, and we do things in a fun way in this horrible disease. So I would encourage everyone to connect with IMALS, and you'll find a spot that you fit in.
To springboard off of what Deb was saying, an easy way to do it is join the constituent map. That would be huge, because we're happy to do the heavy lifting for people who can't, who don't necessarily have the time to get involved, or maybe feel a little unsure of themselves reaching out to members of Congress and such. We are happy to do it, but we need their names. We need their district. We need their representative.
Thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge everybody. I'll start with Pat's acknowledgement of Amanda. He noted that she was key to making the maps come alive, and without her help, they just simply wouldn't have been as impactful. So thanks to Amanda. Thanks always to Pat and your amazing work. And you're so inspired about how this technology can be used to do amazing things and change the impact that this community is having. And thank you so much to Deb and Michelle and Nicole and Sandy for sharing with us all of your thoughts and your great work that made something amazing happen. And it looks like the future is bright for what we can do to support those who have ALS and, like you said, make it more of a chronic disease and not a terminal disease. So appreciate you very much.